Hello everybody, my name is Lim Kenji, and today I'll show you how FIs, especially banks, actually measure climate risk and more importantly whether aligning with the Paris Agreement can still be profitable. Now let's begin with how banks manage and measure climate risk. Climate risk isn't abstract. In some NGFS climate scenarios, world GDP is several percentage points lower by 2050 if policy stays weak. Climate shocks move through households, firms and markets and eventually hits the bank's balance sheet, and that's why it's important to manage climate risk. Banks face two climate channels: physical risks that damage assets and transition risks that reprice high-emitting sectors. As Singapore's carbon tax steps up towards 2030, energy-intensive borrowers' cash flows and their credit risk will shift. Singapore's own physical risk, it's low, but its banks lend heavily across ASEAN, so they effectively import climate risk from more vulnerable markets. And to measure climate risk, banks increasingly use PCAF, a standard launched in 2015 and now used by over 450 FIs. Instead of focusing on the bank's own office emission, it measures the emissions of the client and projects its finances, where transition risk really lies. And across 6 asset classes, it lets banks estimate their scope 1 to 3 emissions in their portfolio. And once they have this map, banks can then use the carbon intensity data to spot high-risk sectors, set tighter lending limits for heavy emitters, or offer better pricing to clients who are genuinely decarbonizing. And the second tool is scenario testing. The NGFS provides common climate scenarios that let banks model shocks, turning climate science into paths for GDP sector output and emissions. Banks map their portfolios to these scenarios and run stress tests to see which borrowers become riskier as carbon prices rise or physical damage increases. And those results inform their expected credit loss models, capital planning, and for leading banks, loan pricing. So climate risk really starts to shape core financial decisions and not just sustainability reports. DBS turns climate modeling into credit decision. It uses NGFS and IEA pathways to score clients' transition plans, linking that to lending limits and pricing. In summary, the PCAF helps banks measure finance emissions more consistently, though data in ASEAN can still be limited sometimes. And the NGFS provides a common baseline for climate stress tests, but the results naturally vary by scenarios. Now I'll move on to how global frameworks guide climate risk management. The simplified pyramid shows how global climate risk standards build on one another, from disclosure all the way to implementation, and I'll break down each layer next and show how they connect with one another. I'll start off with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. It shows banks what to report, and it sets the global rulebook for climate risk reporting. The TCFD sets the what. Banks should disclose governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics, and also run climate scenarios, making climate risk exposure visible to regulators and investors. Moving on to the second layer, the International Sustainability Standards Board. If the TCFD tells banks what to disclose, the ISSB sets the how. The IFRS S2 turns TCFD-style disclosures into consistent, audit-ready standards that tie back to the financial statements. It's where climate disclosure becomes real accountability. Moving on to the third layer, Basel tells banks how to manage and capitalize for climate risk. It's where climate risk becomes banking regulation. Basel brings climate into prudential supervision. Through its 3 pillars, it asks how does climate change affect credit, market, and operational risk, and how that should feed into governance stress tests. Moving on to the last layer, MAS translates these global expectations into local rules. Its environmental risk management guidelines require banks to embed climate risk in governance, risk processes, and disclosures, broadly aligning with the TCFD and Basel, and MAS engages banks on moving towards ISSB consistent reporting. This pyramid is just a simplified way to see how different layers interact. In reality, they feed back into each other. Lastly, I'll be moving on to how FIs, especially banks, can balance profitability with the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement sets the climate goal, and finance decides whether we reach it or not. Banks must cut portfolio emissions without sacrificing returns, and that's the real challenge. Paris alignment means driving down portfolio's emission in line with a 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway, and DBS is one of the few banks with concrete 2030 sector targets and a strategy to help clients transition while tightening limits on carbon-intensive activities. Banks pull 4 main levers to align with the Paris Agreement, and each lever lowers emissions and opens new revenue lines, from green bond underwriting to sustainability-linked fees. Sustainability-linked loans like Keppel's $1 billion facility shows how banks can tie margin to emission cuts and still earn fees and interest income. Evidence from recent studies suggests that on average, greener borrowers default less and green bonds fund slightly cheaper, so Paris alignment can support risk-adjusted returns when done properly. OCBC's case is consistent with that story. It exited new co-financing, ramped up sustainable finance, but that doesn't prove that Paris alignments caused a profit, but it clearly shows that you can decarbonize a portfolio without sacrificing performance. Banks now have consistent tools to measure and stress test climate risk. Global frameworks now form a layered system that's slowly pushing climate risk from voluntary disclosure into real supervision. The Paris Agreement and profitability can coexist, but only when climate risk is properly priced and greenwashing is tightly controlled. And thank you so much for listening to my recording.